When you think about World War II survival, you probably picture the tactics, the ingenuity, the clever hacks soldiers used to stay alive. But here's what nobody talks about: the moment right before those hacks mattered. The psychological breaking point, when a soldier's mind had to choose between surrendering to the cold or engineering one more night of survival. That split-second decision, that mental shift from victim to survivor, that's where the real story lives. And today, we're going deep into the psychology behind winter survival in World War II, because understanding how these men convinced their minds to keep fighting reveals something profound about human resilience that goes far beyond staying warm.
See, every survival technique you've ever heard about from World War II, layering pine boughs, sharing body heat, drying clothes against skin, all of that came after a soldier made a critical psychological decision. They had to override every instinct screaming at them to give up. And the fascinating part? Modern psychologists and survival experts have now identified the exact mental frameworks these soldiers unknowingly used. Frameworks that kept them functional when their bodies were shutting down. So if you've ever wondered what separates someone who survives impossible conditions from someone who doesn't, stay with me. Because by the end of this, you'll understand the invisible battlefield that determined who saw morning and who didn't.
Let's start with what psychologists call the survival override moment. Picture this. You're a 19-year-old American GI in the Ardennes forest during the Battle of the Bulge. It's December 1944. The temperature has dropped to 20 below zero. You haven't slept in 48 hours. Your boots are frozen stiff, your fingers won't bend, and you're lying in a foxhole that feels less like shelter and more like a tomb. In that moment, your brain enters what researchers now call acute stress response paralysis. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for problem-solving and planning, starts shutting down. Blood flow redirects to your core. Your thoughts become foggy. And here's the critical part. Your mind begins offering you a terrible bargain. It whispers that sleep would feel so much better than fighting, that maybe closing your eyes is the reasonable choice. This is the psychological cliff edge that determined survival. Soldiers who made it through weren't necessarily stronger or better equipped. They were the ones who recognized that whisper for what it was. Their brain trying to conserve energy by shutting down non-essential functions, including hope. The survivors developed what trauma psychologists call micro-goal fixation. Instead of thinking about surviving the whole night, which felt impossible, they'd break it down. Make it to the next hour. Keep your hands moving for 10 more minutes. Count to 100, then count again. This wasn't just distraction. It was a sophisticated psychological hack that kept the prefrontal cortex engaged just enough to prevent complete shutdown.
One veteran from the Eastern Front described it perfectly in a post-war interview. He said he would focus entirely on keeping his toes wiggling inside his boots. Not surviving, not dawn, just toe movement. That singular focus created what psychologists now call a cognitive anchor, a mental task simple enough to achieve, but active enough to prevent the mind from drifting into hypothermic delirium. And here's what's remarkable. This technique, born from desperation in frozen foxholes, is now taught in modern military survival training as deliberate sensory engagement. The soldiers figured it out 70 years before science explained why it worked. But let's go deeper into the social psychology of shared survival, because this is where things get really interesting. When soldiers slept shoulder to shoulder for warmth, something more than heat was being shared. Modern research into collective trauma and survival has revealed that physical proximity during crisis activates what's called the tend-and-befriend response, a neurobiological reaction that floods the brain with oxytocin and reduces cortisol levels. In plain terms, being close to another human during extreme stress literally changes your brain chemistry in ways that promote survival. The soldiers didn't know they were triggering ancient evolutionary mechanisms. They just knew that sleeping alone felt more dangerous, and science has now proven they were absolutely right.
There's a documented account from Stalingrad where a group of German soldiers trapped in a basement took turns sleeping in the center of a human circle. The men on the outside rotated inward every hour. What they were unknowingly doing was managing both thermal efficiency and psychological morale through forced interdependence. Everyone got a turn at the warmest spot. Everyone took a turn enduring the cold edge. This created what sociologists call enforced equity in survival, and it had a profound psychological effect. It prevented the most dangerous mental state in group survival situations, the belief that you've been abandoned by your comrades. When everyone suffers equally and everyone benefits equally, the will to survive strengthens across the entire group. Modern mountaineering teams and polar exploration crews now use this exact rotation model, and it traces directly back to lessons learned in frozen trenches. Now, let's talk about the psychology of purposeful discomfort, because this is where soldiers turned the cold into an ally. When troops would remove wet socks and tuck them against their chests to dry overnight, they were doing something counterintuitive. They were choosing to be more uncomfortable in the short term to improve survival odds long term. This requires what psychologists call delayed gratification under duress, which is one of the most sophisticated cognitive functions humans possess. Your brain is hardwired to avoid discomfort immediately. Overriding that instinct when you're already freezing demands extraordinary mental discipline. But here's the insight that changes everything. Soldiers who practice this kind of calculated discomfort reported feeling more in control, not less. By making an active choice to manipulate their environment, even if it meant temporary suffering, they shifted their psychological position from passive victim to active agent. This is a critical distinction that survival psychologists emphasize today. Victimhood mentality accelerates psychological collapse. Agency, even painful agency, reinforces will to live. The act of wringing out wet fabric and deliberately pressing it against cold skin became a ritual of control. It said, "I'm still making decisions. I'm still fighting. I'm not done yet." And that brings us to perhaps the most powerful psychological element of winter survival, the mental narrative soldiers constructed to explain their suffering. Researchers studying trauma resilience have found that humans can endure almost unimaginable hardship if they believe it has meaning. Soldiers who frame their suffering as purposeful, as protecting their brothers in arms, as duty to their country, as defiance against the enemy, those soldiers had statistically higher survival rates than those who saw their suffering as random or meaningless. This isn't just inspiration. This is measurable psychological science. There's a haunting account from a medic at Bastogne who said he stayed awake through 3 consecutive frozen nights by repeating one sentence to himself: "If I sleep, someone dies." He wasn't being dramatic. He was engineering meaning into his suffering. He transformed his personal agony into moral obligation, and that reframe gave him access to energy reserves his body didn't think it had. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy uses this exact technique with patients facing chronic pain or terminal illness. It's called purpose-driven reframing, and it was being practiced instinctively in foxholes decades before psychologists gave it a name. But let's address the dark side of survival psychology, because not every mental strategy was healthy, even if it kept men alive. Some soldiers developed what's now recognized as dissociative survival response. They would mentally separate from their bodies, describing the experience of watching themselves from outside, feeling the cold happen to someone else. This psychological split allowed them to endure conditions that would otherwise break their minds. But post-war psychiatric records show that many of these same soldiers struggled with severe dissociation and PTSD for the rest of their lives. They survived the winter, but the psychological cost was steep.
This raises a profound question that survival psychologists still debate. Is there such a thing as surviving too well? When the mind develops coping mechanisms so extreme that they become permanent, has survival come at too high a price? The soldiers who learned to completely shut down emotional response to cold, fear, and suffering often found they couldn't turn those emotions back on when they returned home. They'd rewired their brains for survival in ways that made peace unbearable. Understanding this helps us appreciate that survival isn't just about making it through the night. It's about making it through the night in a way that still leaves you human on the other side. Now, one of the most overlooked psychological factors in cold weather survival is the role of routine and ritual. Soldiers who established predictable nighttime routines, checking their gear in the same order, arranging their sleeping area with deliberate precision, humming the same song, these soldiers reported feeling less psychological distress than those who approached each night chaotically. What they were doing was creating cognitive scaffolding. When everything else is unpredictable and terrifying, routine becomes an anchor for sanity. Modern sleep psychology confirms this. Humans need predictable patterns to feel safe enough to rest, even in dangerous environments. There's a particularly moving account from a Soviet soldier who described drawing a small picture in the frost on his helmet every night before sleeping. Same picture, every night. A tiny house with smoke coming from the chimney. He said that 5-second ritual convinced his brain he was still capable of creation, not just destruction and survival. He was maintaining his identity as something more than a frozen body in a hole. That's sophisticated psychological self-preservation, and it reveals something beautiful about human nature. Even at the edge of death, we need to remind ourselves we're more than our suffering. The final psychological dimension we need to explore is what soldiers called the morning promise. This was the mental contract they made with themselves. If you can make it to dawn, everything changes. Light means warmth. Dawn means you survived. This created a temporal finish line that made suffering feel bounded rather than infinite. And here's what's psychologically brilliant about it. Even though morning didn't actually solve their problems, they still had to fight the next night. The belief that suffering had an endpoint made it survivable. This is what psychologists call temporal framing, and it's one of the most powerful tools for enduring hardship. But the soldiers who survived winter after winter, month after month of frozen nights, they had to modify the morning promise into something more sustainable. They couldn't keep telling themselves it would end soon because it didn't. So they developed what we might call iterative resilience. Each morning became proof that they could do it again. Each survival became evidence of their capacity. They were building a psychological track record, and that record became its own source of strength. This is the difference between surviving one impossible night and surviving 100. You stop asking if you can, you remember that you have, and that memory becomes fuel. So what does all of this mean for us today? Why does understanding the psychology of World War II winter survival matter? Because the frameworks these soldiers stumbled into through desperation, micro-goal fixation, purpose-driven reframing, enforced equity, cognitive anchoring, temporal framing, these aren't just historical curiosities, these are proven psychological tools that work in any crisis. Whether you're facing actual survival situations, battling chronic illness, enduring financial collapse, or fighting through any circumstance that feels impossible, these mental strategies remain relevant.
The soldiers who survived those frozen nights weren't superhuman.
They were ordinary men who discovered extraordinary things about how the human mind can be leveraged for survival. They learned that resilience isn't a personality trait you either have or don't have. It's a set of cognitive skills that can be practiced, refined, and passed down. And that's exactly what we're doing right here. We're learning from the mental battlefield that raged inside every freezing foxhole, every snow-covered trench, every desperate night when giving up would have been so much easier than continuing. If this exploration into the psychology behind survival gave you a new way to think about human resilience, subscribe to keep these forgotten lessons alive. The past isn't just about what happened. It's about what we can learn from those who faced the impossible and found a way through. Not with better gear, not with perfect conditions, but with nothing more than the power of the human mind refusing to surrender.